There are too many CPUs.
Take your work and gaming experience to the next level with the ViewSonic XG340C 2K ultra-wide high-end display. The XG340C 2K 34-inch 100Hz ultra-wide monitor features HDMI 2.1, AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, a 1000R curved screen, VESA display HDR 400 and 1 millisecond response time for the ultimate immersive gaming experience. And take control of multiple devices with KVM support while also taking full control of your display via the Elite Display Controller. To see the full list of specs and features, follow the sponsored link in the description below. Okay, today's video, a couple things. One, obviously the 7800X3D has just embargo lifted. I say launched because who knows how many will actually be in stores at the moment. I've got one of those installed right here. Obviously my review is late and it's going to be a little late and I've already apologized to AMD. So a little side note, not getting into personal details, been dealing with a lot of health stuff both with my wife and I that has just put me completely behind schedule on things. It's not an excuse, but an explanation to you guys as to why there's no review up from us today. But I've been watching the reviews and even talking behind the scenes with some of the content creators that have already put up their reviews just to try and gather some information, because I'll be honest, the X3D testing is very different from a standard CPU test because they are really designed for gaming. They really are. But today's video is not gonna be about that. It's gonna be about, at the end of the video, I found myself going, this is so confusing for the consumer. And then I started thinking about how many CPUs there actually are available right now and how close together they're stacked. It's no wonder why I get tons of messages and emails from people saying, I don't know what CPU to choose. And I get it, because between the two sockets alone, AM5, this is LGA 1700, but it's a Z690, not a 790, but whatever. Between those two sockets alone, there are, let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, that's just Intel CPUs. 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. 35 possible CPUs that you could use between these two sockets alone. And again, 25 of them belong to Intel alone. This is the this is because CPU competition has been fiercely competitive over the last 6, 7, almost 8 years now. So what you're getting is AMD and Intel trying to create a CPU for any possible little scenario you might possibly need it. So let's start with Intel's dilemma, shall we? Intel is still heavily relying on the power efficiency isn't as important to us right now as core clock and core count is, even though they've got the E-cores, because we're still talking 250 to 300 watt CPUs in real use case, you know, when it comes to power draw and how much heat and stuff it can generate. Whereas AMD, on the other hand, has been a little bit more efficient, but then their X3D stuff has been ultra efficient because of the sensitivity that the Vcache has when it comes to temperatures. So that alone has created such a weird product stack. So let's start with Intel, like I said. If we take a look at their current lineup, there are basically 3 SKUs that you could find, with the exception of the Core i9, and they're kind of easy to explain. So you've got the i3, which is, they've got 3 different CPUs that are 4-core, 8-thread. So all the i3s have hyper-threading built into them, or at least at the very least E-core, P-core stuff, right? Whereas back in the day, i3 was just core to core, that was it. There was no hyper-threading or anything like that. So a Core i5 is a 6-core, 12-thread. The i7 is an 8-core, 16-thread, as well as the 1616, which you'll find in the i9. But if you look at these now, you've got the T variant, the F variant, the non-X variant, or non-K variant, and then the K variant, and then technically the 1300K, the S variant. So do you see the reason why I'm making this video? So at the end of the day, I'm trying to tell you about a problem that exists and maybe give you some food for thought on, if you're shopping for a CPU, how to just take the confusion out of it and make a real decision on things that may not matter to you that you're not gonna pay money for. So for instance, the T variant is a low watt part by Intel designed for like workstations and or small form factor or even down to tablet. So basically an ODM could spec one of these CPUs kind of in any particular range and then get a T variant, which is low watt. So you could throw that in like a slim tablet or like a touchscreen tablet, like a Surface or something like that, right? Spec'd all the way up to an 13900T, which is just weird to me. The F variant means no iGPU installed. So you guys know Intel is, with the exception of their X series stuff or their X299, X99, X79, those CPUs, always had an iGPU in there. It was just some sort of an Intel HD graphics or whatever that was good enough to get you a signal to just make sure everything's working and not need a GPU to be able to give you a video signal. So the F just removes that part from the die altogether, which is usually sought after for people looking for high overclocking CPUs because of the fact that there's less stuff going on in the die that would make it more simple when it comes to overclocking rather than going in there and just turning off the iGPU. You've got the non-K variant, which is a slightly lower clocked, non-overclockable locked CPU, where the only thing you could potentially change is the multiplier, but you can't really go in there and start fine tuning any of the voltages and the overclocks because they are just a much more mainstream locked, not gonna overclock type of CPU. And then we got the S variant, which only exists in the 13900K, which is a KS, which remember the 9900 KS was the first time we saw that, which was denoted keep spending. In the 13900K, it's basically a 200 megahertz bump, giving you up to 6 gigahertz single thread performance. Basically there's a bend, where for the same power limits that you can find with the non-KS, just the K, would give you up to 200 more megahertz performance. And that was really just another response to Intel really leaning heavily on the high clock speed, less power efficient, raw performance in battling AMD's lineup. So those 25 SKUs, the 13100T, 13100F, 13100. Then you got a 13400T, 13400F, 13400, 13490F, 13490F. Okay, sure, I totally missed that one. Then you have a 500 series, so the 13500T, 13500, and then you have a 13600T, 13600, 13600KF, and 13600K. Now the 13600K is where like the gaming stuff really starts to be like, okay, I want a nicer gaming PC. The 13600K is kind of where you're gonna start looking, although the 13100F has actually been really improving itself to be a very competent gaming CPU at an entry-level price that's not gonna break the bank, like well under $200. Solid performer. Again, 4 cores, 8 threads, just gets the job done, no frills. Good gaming CPU. We'll probably take a look at one in the future here. Then you got the 13700T, 13700F, 13700, 13700KF, 13700K, and 13790F. So you can see where like it's just kind of all over the place here. As you go up the stack, right? So the 13900T is up to 5.1. The 13900F and 900 non-F are up to 5.2, and then the 13900KF and 13900K are up to 5.8. So a significant frequency jump from 5.2 to 5.8 from that one SKU, although still the same family of CPU, and then up to 6 on the 13900KS. So already you can see like confusion in going, well, the 13900K is pretty cool, but I don't need the K. I'll just go with the 13900 non-K because I'm not gonna overclock. Well, guess what? You're not only locking the CPU down, you're also losing 600 megahertz. So there's a problem there in terms of just the same name, but shaved down stuff. Kind of like we've complained about with the laptop GPUs on NVIDIA being the same name as their desktop variant parts, but super different cuts. Yeah, same sort of thing. If we look at the AMD lineup, it is less crowded, but still all over the place. So for instance, we got 7600 and a 7600X. So the difference on the non-X and the X part, you can still play around with the clocks and the multipliers and the bus speeds and all that stuff on a non-X part. It's just already lower clock. So for instance, the 7600 is a 5.1 versus the X's 5.3. And then you've got the 7700 and 7700X, 100 megahertz difference there. 7800X3D, that's the new CPU that just came out, and it's interesting because this time there's no non-X3D 800. So there's no 7800, there's no 7800X, but there is the X3D, which if you guys have been watching the videos for the reviews, you'll start to know like the 7800 X3D is as beneficial to gamers as the 5800 X3D is, but the problem is because there's a new flagship 7950 X3D and 7900 X3D CPUs that are more expensive, those were launched first, which now that you can compare the 7800 X3D to, you realize those are a complete waste of money. And there's a problem with if you, like in my instance here, a little side note, I'm running a 7950 X3D on my personal rig. You guys have seen that because I was like, I want to build the ultimate gaming PC. The word ultimate is very subjective because the problem is there's no clear CPU winner right now that just beats one brand at all titles. That doesn't exist right now because the competition is so close, specifically between the 13900K/KS and the 7950X3D. The problem with the 7950X3D and the 7900X3D is the fact that they're double CCDs. There's two CCDs that require a fabric between them, and then the 3D stacked RAM is only present on one CCD. So when you go gaming, you have to turn off one of those CCDs. Well, the problem is when it's time to review it, if you've got a system or an OS that already had a 7900X3D or a 7950X3D installed on it because of the CCD stuff and the drivers specifically designed to turn off certain cores, when you're gaming, even if you uninstall those drivers and reinstall the new chipset drivers and all the new stuff for the 7800X3D, guess what? It still turns off cores in the 7800X3D. I think it might be Microsoft Game Bar that's having something to do with this, but right now, even in the reviewer's guide stuff from AMD, they were like, hey, when you review the CPU, fresh install because reasons, which means part of me went, the 7800X3D is a great gaming CPU that is matching like 95% of the performance of a CPU that costs twice as much. Well, guess what? I can't just drop that CPU in my system because of the fact that I will have to reinstall the OS to literally get rid of any trace of the 7950X3D. Otherwise, my 7800X3D with a single CCD will still turn off cores, which makes no sense at all. Most people are not going to start at a high end and then downgrade, so that won't be a problem for most people. The question is, what does that mean for the next family of CPUs? But when it comes to gamers and the confusions, it's like, you've got all these SKUs, and if you look at AMD and Intel, and they literally will thread together like a zipper, how do you decide what CPU is right for you? Let me tell you first and foremost, pretty much any CPU that you go with today, it doesn't matter if it's a 13100F or a 7950X3D, any CPU today is gonna make a great gaming CPU versus 10 years ago when we had such short product stacks. Remember, 10 years ago, we had Ryzen, no, we didn't have Ryzen, that was 2016. 10 years ago, we had Bulldozer / Pile Driver / Excavator, which were all new code names built on the same architecture, which is just not a great time for AMD in terms of CPU efficiency and performance. And what did Intel give you? An i3, an i5, and an i7. That's it. 3 CPUs you had to choose from. As gamers, it is easy to overspend on a CPU. And when they add, the brands are adding this much confusion to the product stack, because here's the problem. If you watch Gamers Nexus review, which I have, he shows that the real comparison between a 7800X3D is the 7700X. And the thing is, when you have a CPU that is designed around gaming, it, especially with AMD having to reduce the thermal headroom and reduce the core clocks to keep the power efficiency where it needs to be, to keep the cache happy, you give up like workload performance. So the 7700X in workload performance is like beating the 7800X3D in various work use cases because of the fact that it's a much reduced clock. It's only like 4.8 gigahertz all core. Now I say only because the jump between 5000 series and 7000 series in terms of clock speed is pretty massive. But if you remember, we also saw a pretty massive jump in TDP, thermals, and power limit, or power draw, until the X3D CPUs came out. So now as gamers, you have to look at this. What am I doing with my system? Am I only gaming? Then an X3D CPU might make sense, but do you want to spend $400 plus on a gaming CPU when you know that spending $300 or even $260 would more than adequately get the job done and give you more budget available to spend on your GPU? Because the reality is, unless you're going with like a 4090 or 4080 super high-end GPUs that are very expensive, which you probably wouldn't pair with a $250 CPU to begin with, you're not gonna bottleneck your CPU unless you're playing at low resolutions with a high-end graphics card and a low-end CPU. It's so easy to mismatch and pair your systems wrong. And the CPU manufacturers are not doing you any favors by throwing so many freaking options at you. Now remember, I do not believe that neither AMD or Intel are creating so many SKUs for your benefit. They're creating SKUs and counter SKUs for the competition is what they're doing. They are fighting each other and clawing for market share by creating such a wide net of, you guys are the fish, by the way, such a wide net that you're gonna probably land on one of their CPUs somewhere. And the fact that Intel has more than twice the amount of CPUs that AMD has in its current generation. It's just doing nothing but causing confusion in the market. I mean, we've complained about graphics cards in the past, right? And let me tell you AMD's dilemma here. It makes a lot of sense, non-X variant, and then X3D variant, okay? Let's not forget, they have the B650, the X670, and the X670E motherboards on top of that. So now you go, do I go with a non-X CPU, an X CPU, or an X3D CPU, and do I pair that with a B series motherboard, an X series motherboard, or an XE series motherboard? Do you want the extra extreme, the extreme extra extreme, the extreme CPU on the extreme extreme motherboard? It's just crowded for the sake of being crowded. And this is the point, like, it becomes overwhelming even as reviewers, because then we go, okay, what are we gonna compare it to? It's like you start scratching your head, you go, okay, well, I want to include as much data as I can to be able to give as many people shopping, like empirical data that they could use that's not anecdotal, and still say, okay, they've got something out of this review. And it's like, unless you're gonna do the entire stack, no matter what CPUs you choose, there's gonna be something left out that was relevant. And it's really becoming tiresome, I think, as reviewers to have to go through all of this data. Steve he's like an analytics fiend. He loves the data, but I also know he does not love the amount of time he has to spend doing all of this. I also know Linus and Hardware Canucks and Hardware Unboxed. Like, we all love this stuff, but you start going, okay, a new CPU came. How much regression testing has to be done now to make everything on a level comparison ground, because BIOS updates have changed. QVL RAM has changed, like the supported RAM. Are you doing a disservice by going, okay, at the time we reviewed the 7950X, there was only 5,000 and maybe 5,200 megahertz RAM that was available in QVL and working on the CPUs, but now through motherboard revisions and 6 months later in BIOS revisions and RAM revisions, now you can run 6,200 megahertz on it. Do you go back and retest every test you've ever done for every CPU and start over? Or do you do an asterisk and say, we are now running this at a slower RAM speed, even though faster QVL RAM is available? And this is the exact same stuff that you have to consider as a buyer. You're like, what do I buy? So I'm gonna get out of the ranty part of my video now, because I know this sounds a whole lot like, wow, Jay, it sounds like you just hate your job. No, not really. I love what we do, but it's kind of becoming too much when we put ourselves in the mindset of the buyer and the consumer going, if you're standing there in a shelf, have you ever been to Micro Center? Have you seen the shelf of CPUs? What looks like a ton of the same CPU is just the same similar packaging, and it's all the SKUs, and you're just like, and I've seen it. When I go to Micro Center, I kind of like dart in and out where I can, because getting stopped, kind of affects how much time we're there, and we usually run a tight timeline. I've seen this at the counters before. Actually, they can't hold the CPU, but they're like, and then you see this. Motherboard manufacturers, y'all are the other half of the crux, okay? I got a whole nother rant for motherboard manufacturers coming. Don't worry about that. That's coming. That's the other half of the problem with current landscape of CPU components, parts, pricing, availability, and value. Back to the part of the video where it actually tells you guys something useful. If you shoot for like an i5/Ryzen 5 CPU, you can't go wrong. In my opinion, you can't go wrong. I don't care if it's a CPU intensive game like Civ or Minecraft or whatever. Minecraft, it's funny, I've been playing it with my kids lately, and with shaders on and higher end CPUs, like my 8-year-old has an 11900K, my 13-year-old has a 10900K? No, she has a 12900K, something, I can't remember. She had a better CPU than I had for a while. Minecraft is not a problem, even if you put chunks really high. Even if you're running shaders, we just chug through it. So even then, it's like, they're not on the latest tier or generation, and it's like, everything's fine with that. And Minecraft used to be like a CPU benchmark, which you could still stress your CPU if you tried hard. 6 cores, 12 threads, anything modern generation, you're fine. Guaranteed you're fine. You don't even need DDR5. DDR4, perfectly fine. Don't need the highest end. Because the manufacturers, they want you to believe you need this stuff. You need the high end, you need the DDR5, you need the X Extreme X, Extra Extreme, Extreme X, X Extreme, Extra Extreme, Extreme Edition motherboards and crap. You don't. $250 to $300 on a CPU will last you years. $250 on a motherboard is the most you ever need to spend on anything. And maybe $400 on a GPU, that way you have some forward compatibility with modern titles that'll come out in the future using latest technologies that are gonna launch, getting you 3 to 5 years out of your GPU before you need to upgrade. $1,500 system today would blow away any system that was built within the last 5 years for that same price. The problem is most people are just kind of groomed now to think you have to shop at the top because there's so much other stuff below it that maybe it's not as good. Don't overspend on your CPU and don't overcomplicate it. On the Intel side, if you want an iGPU, then get a K or a non-K. Forget the T, that doesn't matter at all. i5, 13600K, 12600K, hell, even 11600K today is still amazing. Ryzen 5, 7700, I guess that would be 7600. Perfect CPU, call it a day. Maybe even still try and get a 5800 X3D if you can, because it didn't have all the plague problems that the current X3D stuff has. I guess the point of this video is just to bring awareness to the buyer going, if you're confused, you're not alone. Even those that are doing this for a living are confused by the amount of possible combinations and how to stack things in comparisons. All right, guys. Like I said, the X3D video is coming. We have a 7800 X3D. We bought a 7900 X3D, and I've got my 7950 X3D separate CPU than the one I have at home that we'll eventually be able to do some direct comparisons on. If you're looking for a gaming CPU and you've bought into the Kool-Aid that the X3D stuff is necessary, then go with the 7800 X3D. Don't get the double CCD stuff because it's really weird how all that works. The downside is that it just causes a little bit more confusion on which is better, a non-X3D or just a regular X. I applaud AMD for pushing the boundaries and kind of changing the way we think about CPUs. They're really applying what they did with like Vega on a CPU now. Because remember, stacked RAM on the GPU years ago didn't really work out so well in their favor, but they're doing it now with CPU that actually showed tangible benefit. I'd like to see us changing the way of how we are just slapping silicon on a substrate and calling it a day. The problem is it's sort of complicating things. And this might be the future of what we see in CPUs, but right now we have two very different philosophies with two very different manufacturers that are just, I think, causing so much confusion in the market now. It's just mind-numbing at this point. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope this video has at least meant something to someone out there. But now that I got it off my chest, I can go ahead and move forward and feel a little better that I've ranted and I'm just coming off as a boomer yelling at a cloud. Silicon cloud. Is that the X3D cloud? Is there a cloud on